The day the HOA decided to reroute all the neighborhood runoff into my field, they treated it like a minor paperwork decision. Just a drainage fix, a quick vote. Problem solved. What they didn't realize was that water has a memory. For weeks, every storm sent thousands of gallons pouring across my land while the board ignored every complaint I made. And then the heavy rain came. By the time the HOA understood what they'd actually done, their own basements were already filling with water. I'd lived on that property for almost 8 years before the trouble started. It sat on the very edge of the subdivision, right where the neat rows of HOA houses stopped and the open land began. My place was different from the rest of the neighborhood. While most of the homes sat on tidy quarter-acre lots with identical mailboxes and carefully approved paint colors, I owned several acres that had once been part of an old farm. The land sloped gently downward, forming a wide, grassy field behind my house. I never built anything on it. Most of the time it just sat there, quiet and open, catching sunlight in the afternoons and fog in the early mornings. During the spring, I let wildflowers grow across it. Sometimes deer would wander through at dusk. It was the main reason I bought the place in the first place. Technically, my property bordered the subdivision governed by the Homeowners Association, but I wasn't part of the HOA myself. My land had been divided from the original farm long before the development went up. The developers built right up to my fence line, then stopped. At first, the HOA didn't bother me much. Their rules mostly applied to the houses inside the neighborhood, things about fences, parking, lawn height. Every now and then I'd get a letter addressed to neighboring property owner, usually about construction notices or landscaping work happening nearby. Nothing serious. But over time, I started hearing complaints from some of the residents about water. After heavy rains, certain streets in the subdivision would collect runoff. Nothing catastrophic, just the kind of standing water that made people nervous about foundations and lawns. At first it seemed like one of those minor neighborhood problems that would eventually get sorted out. Then one evening a flyer appeared in my mailbox. It was an announcement for an HOA meeting about drainage improvements. Apparently the board had hired someone to redesign the way stormwater moved through the neighborhood. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I probably should have. The first real sign that something had changed came after a storm. It wasn't even a particularly bad one, just a long, steady rain that moved through overnight. By morning, the clouds had broken apart and the air smelled clean and cold. I walked out to the back porch with a cup of coffee and looked across the field, the way I usually did. Except that morning, something looked off. There was water standing in the grass. Now that wasn't completely unusual. When the ground gets saturated, parts of a field will hold moisture for a while. But this wasn't just damp soil or shallow puddles. A long, dark strip of water cut straight across the middle of the land like someone had drawn a line through it. And the strange part was where it was coming from. Up near the fence line, the side where the subdivision backed up to my property, a steady stream of muddy runoff was pouring through a narrow gap between two newly installed drainage pipes. Stood there for a moment trying to process what I was seeing. Those pipes hadn't been there before. They stuck out from the small berm behind the last row of HOA houses, angled slightly downward, pointed directly toward my field like two open faucets. Water from the entire neighborhood was draining through them. For a while I just watched it flow. The stream wasn't violent or dramatic. It was constant, relentless. Every few seconds another surge would push out of the pipes and spread across the grass. I remember thinking the same thing anyone would think in that moment. That can't possibly be intentional. So I grabbed a jacket and walked out across the field to take a closer look. The closer I got, the clearer the situation became. The HOA had installed a drainage channel behind the houses along the fence line. It ran like a shallow ditch parallel to my property, collecting runoff from several streets. At the end of the channel, the water fed directly into those two pipes, and those pipes emptied straight into my land. There wasn't even an attempt to disguise it. No gravel bed, no filtration, no retention pond, just a direct outlet. I stood there for a long time staring at it, listening to the water rushing through the metal. Finally, I walked back inside and pulled out the flyer from the HOA meeting. Drainage improvements. It had said, apparently, this was the improvement. At first, I tried to assume the best. Maybe it was temporary construction. Maybe they planned to extend the system further, and this was just a phase of the project. There were a lot of reasonable explanations, so I called the number listed on the HOA notice. It rang for a while before someone answered. A woman who introduced herself as the board secretary. I explained what I'd seen. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she said very casually, "Oh yes, that's part of the new runoff management system." I blinked. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "You mean the pipes draining into my field?" "Yes," she replied. "Our engineers determined that your property sits at the natural drainage point for the area." For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. "You're saying the neighborhood water is supposed to go there?" "Well, water has to go somewhere," she said. "Your field is the lowest elevation." The way she said it, like it was obvious, like it required no further discussion, made my stomach tighten. "No one contacted me about this," I said. Another pause. "The drainage work was approved by the board," she replied. "That's not what I asked." More silence. Finally she said, "If you have concerns, you're welcome to attend the next HOA meeting." And then she hung up. That evening I walked the fence line again. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the water was still flowing. The ground near the pipes had already started turning into soft mud where the runoff spread out across the grass. If another storm came through, the area would flood completely, and the more I studied the setup, the more one detail bothered me. The drainage ditch on the HOA side didn't look temporary. Fresh gravel lined the bottom. The soil had been reinforced with landscape fabric. Someone had clearly spent time and money building the system, which meant this wasn't a short-term fix. It was permanent, and no one had asked for my permission. The next HOA meeting was held 3 days later in the subdivision clubhouse. I almost didn't go. Technically, I wasn't a member of the association, and I knew how these meetings tended to work. Lots of procedural language, lots of people nodding politely while the board talked. But this time, the situation involved my land. So, I showed up. The room was already half full when I walked in. Folding chairs lined the walls, and a long table at the front held 3 board members and a stack of paperwork. Most of the residents looked surprised to see me. I didn't blame them. I rarely attended anything HOA related. The meeting started with the usual routine: minutes from the previous session, landscaping updates, a discussion about parking complaints. Finally, the board president cleared his throat. "Next item," he said, shuffling papers. "Stormwater mitigation project." That got everyone's attention. He launched into a short explanation about runoff concerns in the neighborhood and how the board had hired a contractor to redesign the drainage system. As he spoke, a simple diagram appeared on the projector behind him. I leaned forward. The diagram showed the subdivision streets, the collection ditch, and the outlet pipes. The pipes were labeled clearly. They pointed directly into my property. I raised my hand. The president hesitated, then nodded toward me. "Yes?" I stood up. "I'm the owner of the land behind those pipes," I said. The room went quiet. I gestured toward the diagram. "Did anyone from the board get permission before directing runoff into my field?" The president glanced down at his notes. "Our engineers determined that area serves as the natural drainage basin," he said. That wasn't my question. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One of the other board members leaned toward the microphone. "The system is designed to follow the existing slope of the land," she explained. "Water would flow that direction regardless." I stared at her. It wasn't flowing through 2 metal pipes before. No one answered that. Finally, the president said, "The project has already been completed," and just like that, they moved on to the next agenda item. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation got worse. Every rainfall sent another surge of water pouring into the field. At first, the grass absorbed some of it. But eventually the ground became so saturated that the runoff started spreading farther and farther outward. Large patches of soil turned into standing pools. The western side of the field, normally dry even in heavy weather, became a soggy marsh, and the pipes never stopped. Even during lighter rainstorms, water continued draining through the HOA ditch and out into my property. I documented everything: photos, videos, measurements of the flooded areas. Then I called the county zoning office. The person I spoke with sounded interested at first. Redirecting stormwater onto private land without permission can raise legal issues. But when I described the situation more fully, his tone became cautious. "Is the runoff coming from a natural slope?" he asked. "Originally, yes. If the water would naturally flow in that direction anyway, it complicates an enforcement system," he sighed. "So they can just accelerate it?" I asked. "I didn't say that," he replied. "But proving liability can be difficult." That wasn't exactly reassuring. A week later, a letter arrived. It came from the HOA. Inside was a polite but oddly worded notice explaining that the drainage system behind the subdivision needed clear access for maintenance. Specifically, they requested that I remove a section of my fence near the pipes to allow their contractors easier entry to the outlet area. I read the letter twice. They were asking me to take down my own fence so they could maintain the system, dumping water onto my land. That was the moment something in my patience snapped. I drove back to the fence line and stood there watching the water flow again. For a long time, trying to understand exactly what the HOA had built. The ditch collected runoff from multiple streets. That much was obvious, but as I traced the layout, something else started to become clear. The drainage system didn't just move water toward my field, it moved water away from something else, from the homes uphill, from the houses with finished basements. The system had been designed to protect those properties by pushing stormwater downhill as quickly as possible, and suddenly a quiet thought crossed my mind. Water moves downhill, but when too much water moves too fast, sometimes it comes back, and if that ever happened, the HOA might discover that their drainage solution wasn't quite as clever as they thought. The storm that finally changed everything arrived in late October. Up until then, most of the rain had been steady but manageable. Long gray days, light showers, the kind of weather that soaks into the ground slowly. Annoying, but not catastrophic. This storm was different. The forecast had warned about it for days. A massive front moving in from the west, pulling warm moisture up from the Gulf and slamming it against colder air. Meteorologists were using phrases like sustained rainfall and ground saturation. By the time the clouds rolled in that afternoon, the sky had that heavy metallic look that means something serious is coming. I walked out to the back porch and looked across the field. The ground was already soft from weeks of runoff. The muddy stretch beneath the HOA pipes had widened into a shallow basin that spread across the center of the land. If a lot of water came through those pipes tonight, there would be nowhere for it to go. But I didn't touch the system. I didn't block anything. I didn't alter the drainage in any way. I simply watched, and I kept recording. The rain started around sunset. At first, it was just a quiet tapping against the roof. Then the wind picked up. Within an hour, the storm settled into a relentless downpour that turned the entire night into a sheet of gray water. Rain hammered the windows, ran in streams down the driveway, and drummed across the metal roof of the barn. Out in the field, the pipes were already roaring. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down to the fence line. Even in the dark, I could hear the deep rushing sound of stormwater being forced through the HOA drainage ditch. The pipes were blasting water now, not a trickle, a full surge. Every few seconds, another wave shot out into the mud, spreading across the field like someone emptying a swimming pool. The basin filled quickly. Within 30 minutes, the standing water had doubled. Within an hour, it had spread halfway across the field. But something else was happening too. The water wasn't just spreading outward anymore, it was rising. By midnight, the basin looked like a small lake. Rain continued pouring from the sky while the HOA pipes dumped more runoff into the center of it. The ground underneath had long since reached its limit. The water had nowhere left to soak, so it began pushing outward, slowly at first, then faster. The field sloped in several directions, and once the water reached the higher ground near the far edge, gravity took over. I watched as the overflow began, slipping into the shallow natural channels that crossed the property. Those channels had existed long before the subdivision was built. Old farm drainage paths carved by decades of rain and erosion, and they all flowed the same direction, back toward the neighborhood. The first phone call came around 1 a.m. It was my neighbor Mark, who lived in the last house on the HOA street above the ditch. His voice sounded tense. "Hey," he said. Are you seeing this water out there? I am, I replied. It's coming through the storm drains on our street, he said. They're backing up. I looked back across the dark field. The basin was now overflowing steadily into the natural channels. Yeah, I said quietly. That might happen. There was a pause. Then Mark asked the question that had been building for weeks. Did the HOA design that drainage system to empty into your property? Yes, I said. Another silence. Then he muttered something under his breath. By 2 in the morning, the situation escalated. Emergency vehicles rolled into the subdivision with flashing lights reflecting off the rain-soaked pavement. From the porch, I could see people moving around with flashlights. Pumps were being dragged from garages. Basement doors were opening and closing. The HOA drainage system was overwhelmed. All the water the board had forced downhill over the past month had saturated the ground beyond its capacity. Now the storm was adding more, far more than the system could carry away. And when the basin in my field overflowed, the excess followed the oldest paths on the land. Right back toward the development. Storm drains began backing up first, then yard grates, then basement sump pumps. Water was returning faster than the pipes could move it. Around 3 in the morning, headlights turned down my driveway. A truck pulled up near the barn, and several people climbed out wearing rain jackets. I recognized 2 of them immediately, the HOA board president and the secretary I'd spoken to on the phone weeks earlier. They walked toward the fence line, shining flashlights across the flooded field. The president spotted me standing on the porch and waved. "Can we talk?" He shouted over the rain. I walked down to meet them. Up close, they looked exhausted and soaked. "The drainage system is failing," he said without preamble. I nodded. "I can see that." He gestured toward the flooded basin. "The water from your field is flowing back into the neighborhood." I let that sit in the air for a moment. "Interesting," I said calmly. "Because last month you told me the field was the natural drainage point." Neither of them spoke. Finally, the secretary said, "We need to reduce the overflow." "How?" I asked. "Well, we were hoping you could dig a temporary trench or open a channel further down your property. Redirect the water somewhere else." Looked out across the dark water covering the field, then back at them. "So you want me to redesign your drainage system? In the middle of a storm?" "It's an emergency," the president said. I folded my arms. "For weeks I asked the board to reconsider that outlet pipe," I said. "You told me the project was finished." Rain hammered down around us. No one argued. Because there wasn't really anything they could say. The system they built had done exactly what it was designed to do: push water away from their homes. They just hadn't thought far enough ahead to ask what would happen after that water arrived somewhere else. Eventually, the president exhaled slowly. "We're going to have to shut down the pipes," he muttered. I nodded. That would probably help. The 2 of them stood there for a moment longer, staring across the flooded field as if seeing the consequences of their plan for the first time. Then they turned and walked back toward their truck. And as the headlights disappeared down the driveway, I realized something. For the first time since the whole situation started, the HOA finally understood exactly what they had done. The rain finally slowed just before sunrise. By then, the entire night had blurred together into the steady roar of water and wind. When the storm clouds finally began to break apart, the neighborhood looked like it had survived a long, exhausting battle with gravity. I walked back down to the fence line just as the first gray light crept over the horizon. The field was still, covered in water, though the level had started dropping slowly now that the rain had stopped. The 2 pipes behind the subdivision were silent. Someone from the HOA had clearly shut them down during the night. For the first time in weeks, nothing was pouring into my property. Across the fence, though, the neighborhood looked like a disaster scene. Driveway lights were still on. Garage doors were open. A few residents stood outside talking quietly while others hauled wet boxes and furniture out onto their lawns. Several basement windows had been removed so hoses could run outside. Portable pumps hummed in the distance. It wasn't catastrophic flooding. The houses were still standing, the streets intact. But the damage was obvious. When stormwater systems fail, they fail quickly, and that night, the system the HOA had proudly installed had reached its limit. Later that afternoon, I received another call from Mark. His voice sounded tired. "You see the mess over here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Looks rough." 3 houses on our street had basement flooding, he told me. Couple more had water come through the storm drains. I leaned against the porch railing. "That's unfortunate." Mark gave a dry laugh. "The board's holding an emergency meeting tonight." That didn't surprise me. When homeowners start dragging soaked drywall and ruined furniture out of their basements, things tend to move quickly. The meeting that evening was packed. I hadn't originally planned to attend, but curiosity got the better of me. So I drove over to the clubhouse and slipped into the back of the room just before it started. The atmosphere felt completely different from the last time I'd been there. Back then, the board members had spoken with calm confidence about their drainage solution. Tonight, they looked tense. Stacks of paperwork covered the table in front of them. Several residents sat with crossed arms, clearly frustrated. The president cleared his throat and began. "As everyone is aware," he said carefully, "last night's storm revealed significant issues with the current drainage system." That was one way to put it. He went on to explain that the runoff design had accelerated water flow into the lower basin, my field, faster than the surrounding soil could absorb it. When the basin filled beyond capacity, the overflow followed older drainage channels that led back toward the neighborhood infrastructure, which meant the water they'd tried so hard to redirect had eventually returned. Only this time, it came back all at once. A resident near the front raised his hand. "So the system caused the flooding?" he asked bluntly. The board members exchanged looks. "The system contributed to the conditions," the president admitted. Another voice spoke up. "Why were those pipes installed in the first place?" That question shifted the mood of the room. Instantly. Because suddenly everyone realized something. Most of the residents hadn't actually known where the runoff was being directed. They just trusted the board to handle the problem. One by one, heads began turning toward the diagram projected on the wall, the same diagram I'd seen weeks earlier. And now, for the first time, the audience in that room understood exactly what it showed. Water from the neighborhood, funneling directly into a private property, my property. A woman 2 rows ahead of me frowned. "Wait," she said. "Did the owner of that land approve this?" The room went quiet. The president hesitated. "No," he said. That single word carried more weight than any argument I could have made. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Insurance claims were filed. Contractors inspected drainage lines. Engineers were brought in to review the entire stormwater design, and the conclusions weren't particularly kind to the HOA board. Redirecting runoff through a concentrated pipe system had dramatically increased the volume and speed of water entering the basin behind the neighborhood. Without proper retention structures or overflow planning, the system had effectively turned the field into a temporary reservoir. Once it filled, the excess water simply followed the natural terrain, back toward the houses the board had been trying to protect. The engineers recommended a completely different approach. Instead of dumping water downhill as fast as possible, the neighborhood would need a series of retention areas and controlled release channels to slow the flow during storms. Other words, they needed to undo most of what they'd built. One afternoon, about a month later, the HOA president came to my door. This time he wasn't carrying diagrams or meeting notes, just a simple folder. "I owe you an apology," he said after I invited him inside. He explained that the board had voted to remove the drainage pipes entirely and replace the system with a redesigned runoff plan inside the subdivision. No more outlets pointed at my land, no more requests to alter my fence. They would also restore the damaged section of the field near the pipes, regrading the soil and planting grass to stabilize the ground again. I listened quietly while he spoke. When he finished, he slid the folder across the table. Inside was a formal agreement outlining the changes. "The board realizes we should have handled this differently," he said. That might have been the understatement of the year, but the important part was that they finally understood something they hadn't considered before. Land doesn't stop mattering just because it sits outside an HOA boundary, and water doesn't care about meeting minutes or board approvals. It simply follows the path that gravity and human decisions create for it. By the following spring, the neighborhood looked normal again. The pipes were gone. The ditch behind the fence had been filled in and replaced with a smaller drainage channel that fed into a retention pond inside the development. During the next heavy rainstorm, the system held perfectly. No flooding, no runoff pouring into my field, just slow, controlled drainage the way it should have been designed from the beginning. And standing on my porch one evening, watching clouds roll over the hills again, I found myself thinking about how strange the whole situation had been. All the arguments, all the meetings, all the frustration. It could have been avoided with one simple decision, a conversation. Because sometimes the biggest problems in a neighborhood don't come from storms or drainage or property lines. They come from the moment someone decides it's easier to make a decision for their neighbor, instead of simply talking to them first. And that's how a simple drainage fix turned into one of the most expensive lessons that HOA had ever learned. For weeks, they treated the problem like it belonged to someone else, like it could just be pushed downhill and forgotten. But water has a funny way of reminding people that every decision has consequences. In the end, the pipes disappeared, the field recovered, and the neighborhood finally built the system they should have started with in the first place. But the real lesson wasn't about engineering. It was about respect. Because sometimes the biggest neighborhood problems start the moment someone decides it's easier to make decisions about their neighbor instead of simply talking to them. And honestly, I still wonder how different things might have been if someone had just knocked on my door before they started digging. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real neighborhood drama, property disputes, and HOA showdowns, stick around. There are plenty more stories where this one came from.